I graduated from Rhode Island College's nursing program in May 2023, passed my NCLEX RN exam on the first try in July, and by October I was filling out applications everywhere within a 30-mile radius of Providence. The market was supposedly desperate for nurses. Every news outlet had been running stories about the shortage since the pandemic, but entry-level positions were harder to find than anyone admitted. Most hospitals wanted 2 years of experience, which created an impossible paradox for new graduates like me. That's why when Mercy Hospital called me on October 27th with a job offer, I didn't hesitate. The pay was actually above market rate for a new grad, $68 an hour for the overnight shift, which ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The recruitment coordinator, a woman named Patricia with a voice that sounded like she'd smoked 2 packs a day for 30 years, explained that they'd recently had several night shift positions open up unexpectedly. She used that word specifically, unexpectedly. At the time, I assumed it meant people had quit. I didn't think to ask why multiple experienced nurses would simultaneously abandon above-market rate positions. Mercy Hospital was built in 1892 by the Sisters of Mercy, a Catholic nursing order. The original structure was a 3-story brick building in the Federal style, with those tall windows and white trim that you see in old New England architecture. Over the decades, they'd added wings and floors, creating a maze-like structure that somehow maintained its historic facade while housing modern medical technology inside. It sat on Benefit Street, which locals called the Mile of History because of all the preserved colonial and Victorian buildings. During the day, it looked almost charming, like something from a postcard of historic Providence. At night, under the orange sodium lights of the parking lot, it looked like something different entirely. I arrived at 10:30 p.m. on November 3rd for my first shift, giving myself extra time to find parking and get oriented. The employee entrance was around the back, past the loading docks where they delivered medical supplies and, I assumed, removed the deceased. A security guard named Marcus checked my new employee badge. I'd gotten it in the mail 3 days earlier, along with a packet of orientation materials I'd barely had time to read through. Marcus was maybe 60, with white hair, and the deliberate movements of someone whose knees had given up on hurrying decades ago. He waved me through without much interest, already looking back down at his phone. The overnight charge nurse was named Violet Richardson, and she'd been working at Mercy Hospital for 19 years, all of them on the night shift. She was a short woman, maybe 5'2", with gray hair cut in a practical bob, and the kind of efficient movements that come from nearly 2 decades of muscle memory. When she shook my hand, her grip was firm, clinical, assessing. She looked at me the way I imagine surgeons look at anatomy diagrams, identifying the relevant parts, dismissing the rest. She led me through the 3rd-floor hallway where I'd be working, explaining the layout as we walked. Mercy Hospital's 3rd floor was dedicated to general medical patients, people recovering from surgeries, managing chronic conditions, or waiting for placement in long-term care facilities. 24 rooms, most of them doubles, with a central nursing station positioned where staff could see down both corridors. The paint was newer than the building, that specific shade of pale blue-green that every hospital in America seems to use, the color that's supposed to be calming, but just makes everything look slightly underwater. The night shift had 4 nurses total for 48 patients, which meant each of us was responsible for 12. Violet assigned me to rooms 301 through 312, the East Corridor. She explained that overnight was generally quieter than day shifts, fewer procedures, fewer visitors, fewer doctors rounding. Our main responsibilities were administering scheduled medications, responding to call lights, monitoring vitals, and documenting everything in the electronic medical record system. She made it sound routine, almost boring. I remember feeling grateful for that. After 4 years of nursing school clinical rotations, boring sounded perfect. But then she paused outside room 307, her hand on the door frame, and said something that didn't make sense at the time. "This room has specific protocols. I'll go over them with you before you take any patients in here." She didn't elaborate. She just continued the tour, showing me where supplies were kept, how to access the medication dispensing system, where the break room was located. But I noticed something as we walked. She hadn't opened the door to 307. She'd stopped outside every other room, letting me glance in at the sleeping patients, pointing out which ones might need extra attention during the night. But 307's door stayed closed, and when I looked at the room assignment board at the nursing station, that room was listed as empty. The first few hours of my shift passed exactly as Violet had described. Quiet. Almost unnervingly so, after the chaos of my clinical rotations at Rhode Island Hospital downtown. I administered midnight medications, responded to 2 call lights from patients needing assistance to the bathroom, and documented everything with the kind of meticulous detail they'd drilled into us in school. By 2 a.m., most of the floor was silent except for the occasional beeping of IV pumps and the rhythmic sound of someone's CPAP machine from room 305. I was at the nursing station, catching up on charting, when the call light for room 307 illuminated on the board. That soft chiming sound, the one designed not to startle but impossible to ignore. I stared at it for a moment, confused, because according to the assignment board, that room was empty. I looked down the east corridor. The door was closed, lights off, exactly as it had been all night. The call light chimed again, more insistent, and I realized no one else was moving to answer it. Violet was in room 318, administering medication. The other 2 nurses were in the west corridor, which meant I needed to check 307 myself. I stood up, grabbed my stethoscope from habit even though it made no sense to bring it to an empty room, and walked down the corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that 60-cycle hum you don't notice until you're alone in a quiet hallway at 2 in the morning. My shoes squeaked slightly on the linoleum floor. They were new, the kind with extra arch support that every experienced nurse had recommended during school. I reached room 307 and knocked lightly, the way we'd been trained. Always knock, always announce yourself, always respect patient dignity even in emergencies. No response. I knocked again, waited, then slowly pushed open the door. The room was empty. Not just empty of patients, completely empty. No bed, no medical equipment, no monitors, no chairs, just bare walls, bare floor, and a window with the blinds drawn. The call light button was mounted on the wall where the bed should have been, and even in the darkness I could see it wasn't illuminated anymore. But I had definitely seen it light up at the nursing station. Twice. I stood in the doorway, one hand still on the door handle, trying to logic through what I'd just witnessed. Old wiring, probably. These historic buildings, you had to expect electrical quirks. The call light system was probably original to some renovation from the 70s, and signals got crossed sometimes. That had to be it. I was about to close the door when I noticed something on the floor near where the bed should have been. A small dark stain on the linoleum, roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate. And when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a stain at all, but a discoloration worn into the floor itself, as if something had rested in that exact spot for so long that it had permanently marked the surface beneath it. I closed the door and walked back to the nursing station. Violet had emerged from room 318 and was charting on one of the computers. I mentioned the call light from 307, trying to keep my tone casual, professional, just reporting a malfunction. She didn't look up from her screen. Her response was delivered in that same flat, clinical tone she'd used for the entire orientation. But I caught something underneath it. Not quite warning, not quite resignation. Something in between. She told me that 307 had electrical issues, that maintenance had been notified multiple times, that I should just cancel the alert at the nursing station if it happened again, and not bother going down to check. Then she added, still not looking at me, that the room had been empty for 6 weeks now, since the last patient had been transferred to another floor. She didn't say why the patient had been transferred. She didn't say why the room had been completely emptied of all furniture and equipment. And when I asked if they were planning to renovate it, she just said that decision was above her pay grade, and I should focus on my assigned patients in the occupied rooms. I went back to my charting. But for the rest of that first shift, I found myself glancing down the east corridor toward room 307, watching that closed door. wondering why a simple electrical malfunction felt like something I shouldn't ignore. By 7 a.m., when my shift ended and I walked out into the gray November morning, I'd almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. New job nerves, that's all. Every workplace has quirks. Every old building has stories. I drove home to my apartment in Federal Hill, showered, ate breakfast, and slept through the day with my blackout curtains drawn. But that night, when I returned for my second shift, Room 307's call light activated 4 more times. And each time, I could have sworn I heard something from behind that closed door. Not quite a sound, more like the absence of sound. A pocket of silence that was somehow louder than the ambient noise of the hospital around it. By the end of my first week, I'd settled into the rhythm of night shift nursing. The human body doesn't naturally want to be awake from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I spent my days off trying to maintain a nocturnal schedule, sleeping with blackout curtains and white noise machines, eating dinner at midnight, and breakfast at 8 in the morning. It's a strange way to live, disconnected from the normal flow of daylight and society, but there's something almost peaceful about it once you adjust. The world belongs to different people at night. I learned the patterns of my assigned patients quickly. Mrs. Chen in 303 always needed her 2 a.m. blood pressure medication crushed and mixed with applesauce because she couldn't swallow pills. Mr. Patterson in 308 had to be repositioned every 2 hours to prevent bed sores from his extended hospital stay. The woman in 311, whose name I'll change to Sarah for privacy, was recovering from abdominal surgery and needed her pain medication administered precisely on schedule, or she'd be awake in agony. These were the routines of institutional care, the small acts of attention that made the difference between healing and suffering. But I also learned other patterns, the ones that didn't appear in any orientation manual. I learned that Violet Richardson always worked rooms on the west corridor, never the east. I learned that Marcus, the security guard, did his rounds clockwise through the building, reaching the 3rd floor at exactly 3:15 a.m. every shift. And I learned that Room 307's call light activated at least 3 times per night, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always when I was alone at the nursing station. On November 9th, my 6th shift, I broke protocol. When the call light for 307 illuminated at 2:47 a.m., I didn't cancel it at the nursing station. I walked down to the room, opened the door, and stepped inside. The room was still empty, unchanged from my first night. But standing in the darkness, I noticed details I'd missed before. The window faced east, toward the water, and even with the blinds drawn, there was enough ambient light from the city to see the room's dimensions. It was slightly larger than the other patient rooms, maybe 12 by 14 feet, instead of the standard 10 by 12. The walls had that texture that comes from being painted repeatedly over decades, layers accumulating until the surface isn't quite flat anymore. And there was something else. A faint smell, not quite antiseptic, not quite decay, something in between, like the smell of a closed room in an old house. That specific mustiness that comes from air that hasn't circulated in a long time. But hospitals don't smell like that. Hospitals smell like bleach and hand sanitizer and that specific chemical scent of industrial cleaning products. This was different, older, almost organic. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight function, sweeping the beam across the floor. That circular discoloration I'd noticed on my first night was still there, and now I could see it more clearly. It wasn't a stain. It was worn into the actual surface of the linoleum, as if something heavy had rested there for so long that it had compressed and discolored the material beneath. The mark was positioned exactly where the head of a hospital bed would be placed, following standard room configurations. I moved the flashlight beam to the walls, looking for anything unusual. Nothing obvious, just painted drywall, smooth and institutional. But when I angled the light sharply across the surface, I noticed something. Very faint scratches in the paint, near where the bed's side rails would have been. 4 parallel lines, each about 6 inches long, running vertically down the wall. The kind of marks that fingernails might make if someone was gripping the wall very tightly, or if they were trying to hold on to something as they were being moved against their will. I was examining those scratches when I heard it. A sound from somewhere in the room that made absolutely no sense, because the room was completely empty and I was standing in the middle of it. It was the electronic beeping of a heart rate monitor. Slow, steady, rhythmic. Beep, beep, beep. The exact tempo of a resting heartbeat, maybe 60 beats per minute. I spun around, my phone's flashlight sweeping the room, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing there. No equipment, no monitors, no possible explanation for that sound. The beeping continued for maybe 10 seconds, and then it changed. The rhythm accelerated, 70 beats per minute, then 80, then faster still, the beeps coming closer together, the pattern of a heart rate increasing toward tachycardia. In my training, I'd learned to recognize this progression. It's what happens when a patient's body is under stress, when the sympathetic nervous system activates, when something is going very wrong. And then, at what must have been over 120 beats per minute, the sound became continuous, that high-pitched alarm tone that every medical professional recognizes instantly. The sound that means a patient's heart has entered a dangerous rhythm or stopped entirely. The sound lasted for exactly 5 seconds before it cut off abruptly, leaving the room in total silence. I stood in that empty room, my own heart hammering in my chest, trying to rationalize what I'd just heard. Old wiring, maybe. Sound traveling through ventilation ducts from another floor. Some kind of echo or acoustic anomaly in this historic building. But I'd been standing in the center of an empty room, and that sound had been right there with me, as clear and close as if I'd been standing next to the actual monitor. I left room 307 and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking slightly as I walked back to the nursing station. Violet was there, preparing medications for the 4 a.m. rounds. She looked at me, and I saw recognition in her eyes. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, like she knew exactly where I'd been and what I'd experienced. She didn't ask me about it. She just handed me a small paper cup with pills for Mrs. Chen and told me it was time for the 2 a.m. medication rounds, even though it was now past 3. Her message was clear. Focus on the work. Focus on the living patients. Don't ask questions about the empty room. But that night, after my shift ended, and I was driving home through the early morning traffic, I couldn't stop thinking about those sounds. Heart rate monitors don't work without being connected to something. They're machines that interpret electrical signals from the human body. They don't just spontaneously generate rhythms in empty rooms. Unless they weren't spontaneous. Unless they were playing back something that had been recorded somehow in that space. I got home, opened my laptop, and searched for Mercy Hospital Providence Deaths Room 307. And what I found made me realize my first week had been the easy part. The search results were frustratingly vague. News articles from 2019, 2015, 2011, always carefully worded, always using phrases like unexpected complications and currently under review. But there were enough of them, spread over enough years, to establish a pattern. Patients dying in room 307. Not constantly, not frequently enough to make headlines, but regularly enough that if you were looking for it, if you were counting, you'd see something that couldn't be coincidental. I found an article from the Providence Journal dated March 2019 about a wrongful death lawsuit filed against Mercy Hospital. The family of a patient named Dorothy Whitman was suing, claiming negligence had led to her death. The article mentioned that Mrs. Whitman had been moved to a third-floor room 2 days before her death, and that she had died of cardiac arrest, despite having no prior heart conditions. The lawsuit was settled out of court 6 months later, terms undisclosed, which usually means the hospital paid enough money to make the family stop asking questions. I searched for more lawsuits, found 3 others, all settled, all with similar patterns. Patients transferred to the 3rd floor, dying within days, families questioning the circumstances. None of the articles specified which room, but the timeline matched. And all of them mentioned the same detail. The patients had died in the early morning hours, always between 2 and 4 a.m. I knew I should have slept. I had another shift starting in 12 hours, and the night shift requires you to be sharp because mistakes made at 3 a.m. can kill people. But instead, I spent the entire day digging through public records, news archives, medical board complaints, anything I could find about Mercy Hospital's third floor. And I found something else. Something that made me realize room 307 wasn't just the site of recent deaths. Something that suggested whatever was happening there had been happening for a very, very long time. In 1952, Mercy Hospital had participated in a research study funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. The study was investigating new treatments for what they called persistent anxiety disorders, what we might now call PTSD or severe anxiety conditions. The study had used something called sustained immobilization therapy, which, as far as I could determine from the vague medical literature I found, involved keeping patients physically restrained in a single position for extended periods while administering various experimental medications. The study had been conducted in the hospital's third-floor ward, and while the documentation didn't specify exact room numbers, the study had lasted from 1952 to 1957, and then it had abruptly stopped with no published results, no follow-up papers, no conclusions. Studies don't just stop like that. Not 5 years in. Not without documentation about why. I took a screenshot of everything I found, saved it to a folder on my laptop, and finally tried to sleep. But I kept thinking about those scratches on the wall of room 307. Those 4 parallel lines that looked like fingernail marks. Thinking about what sustained immobilization therapy might actually mean. Thinking about how many patients had been in that room between 1952 and now. That night, November 10th, when I returned for my shift, I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. There was a plaque on the wall near the nursing station. One of those brass memorial plaques that hospitals put up to thank donors or commemorate important figures. This one was dedicated to Dr. Francis Holloway, noting that he'd served as chief of psychiatry at Mercy Hospital from 1948 to 1958, and that the third-floor psychiatric ward had been renamed in his honor. Psychiatric ward. The third floor had been a psychiatric ward, and now it was general medical. But the rooms were the same, the structure was the same, and room 307 was still exactly where it had been in 1952, when Dr. Francis Holloway was conducting his study on sustained immobilization therapy. I started my shift that night with a simple plan: do my job, take care of my patients, and ignore room 307 completely. Just get through 8 hours, go home, and maybe start looking for a different job at a hospital without a history of unexplained deaths and abandoned experimental protocols. But at 3:47 a.m., while I was in room 310 adjusting Mr. Patterson's position in bed, I heard Violet's voice over the hallway speakers, urgent and sharp in a way I'd never heard before. Code blue, third floor, room 307. And I realized the room wasn't empty anymore. The code blue protocol is designed for speed. When someone's heart stops, every second without circulation causes brain damage. The standard response is that the closest available staff member begins CPR immediately, while others bring emergency equipment. I'd practiced this dozens of times in simulation labs during nursing school, but I'd never actually responded to a real code. I ran toward room 307. Violet was already inside. I could see her through the open door, standing next to a hospital bed that definitely had not been there at the beginning of our shift. There was a patient in the bed, and even from the hallway, I could see the characteristic stillness that comes when someone's heart has stopped. No chest movement, no response to stimulation, that specific quality of absence that separates a living body from a corpse. Violet was performing chest compressions with the mechanical rhythm of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. 30 compressions, pause for breaths, 30 more compressions. The other night shift nurses arrived with the crash cart, the mobile cabinet containing the defibrillator, emergency medications, intubation equipment. One of them, a nurse named Patricia, took over compressions while Violet pulled the defibrillator pads from the cart and attached them to the patient's chest. I was standing in the doorway, trying to process what I was seeing. The room that had been completely empty 12 hours ago now contained a full hospital bed with standard equipment, IV pump, cardiac monitor, oxygen delivery system, all of it arranged exactly as it would be for any patient. But none of that equipment had been there earlier. I'd been in this room just 4 hours ago, and it had been bare walls and empty floor. The cardiac monitor showed a flat line, a systole, the absence of all electrical activity in the heart, and I noticed something that made my blood go cold. The timestamp on the monitor showed the arrest had begun at exactly 3:47 a.m. Violet called for epinephrine, and I watched Patricia push the medication through the IV line while another nurse continued compressions. This went on for 20 minutes. The standard protocol for resuscitation attempts, cycling through medications and defibrillation attempts, everyone following the algorithm we'd all memorized in our training. But I could see in Violet's face that she already knew how this would end. There was something about her movements, efficient but resigned, like she was following a script she'd performed too many times before. At 4:07 a.m., exactly 20 minutes after the code had been called, Violet stopped the resuscitation attempt and called the time of death. The physician on call, a doctor I'd never met before, who'd apparently been waiting in the hallway, came in, confirmed no pulse, no respirations, no neurological activity, and signed the death pronouncement in the chart. The whole thing took less than 90 seconds, like he'd been expecting it. The other nurses began the post-mortem care protocol, disconnecting equipment, preparing the body for the morgue, documenting everything. I stood there watching, and finally asked the question that none of them seemed interested in addressing. Who was this patient, and when had they been admitted to room 307? Violet looked at me with that same flat expression she'd worn since my first night, and told me the patient's name was Michael Reeves, age 41, admitted 3 days ago for observation following a minor car accident. She said he'd been stable all evening, no concerning symptoms, normal vital signs at the midnight check. She said sometimes these things just happen. Unexpected complications, undiagnosed conditions, the unpredictable nature of human biology. But I'd been working this floor for 10 days now. I'd reviewed the patient assignment board every single shift. There had been no Michael Reeves listed anywhere. Room 307 had been marked empty every single night, and more than that, if a patient had been admitted 3 days ago, that would have been November 7th. And I'd definitely checked room 307 on that date, because the call light had activated. The room had been empty then, just as it had been empty for my entire employment at Mercy Hospital. I was about to say something, about to point out these inconsistencies, when Patricia touched my arm and very quietly suggested that I go take my break, that I looked pale, that the first code blue is always difficult for new nurses. The message was clear. Don't ask questions, don't make problems, accept the official narrative and move on. But I couldn't move on, because nothing about this made sense. Hospital beds don't materialize out of nowhere. Patients don't get admitted to rooms without any documentation, and deaths don't occur at the exact same time, 3:47 a.m., as all those previous deaths I'd found in news articles. I went to the break room, but instead of taking a break, I opened my phone and searched for Michael Reeves' name along with Providence and car accident. Found nothing recent. Searched the Rhode Island Department of Health's death registry, which is publicly available within 24 hours of a reported death. Nothing for Michael Reeves. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I accessed the hospital's electronic medical record system and searched for Michael Reeves in the patient database. The system should have shown an active chart if he'd been admitted 3 days ago. Instead, I got an error message. Patient record not found. I sat in that break room, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Either the hospital's record system had somehow failed to document a patient's entire 3-day admission and subsequent death, or I'd just watched a code blue performed on someone who officially didn't exist. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I administered medications, responded to call lights, documented care for my assigned patients, all while trying to appear normal and competent. But I kept glancing down the hallway toward room 307, where the door was now closed again, where the body of Michael Reeves, or whoever he actually was, had been transported to the morgue by staff I'd never seen before. At 7 a.m., when I was signing out to the day shift nurses, I noticed something on the assignment board. Room 307 was listed as empty, pending maintenance. No mention of a death, no mention of a patient. Nothing to indicate that anything unusual had occurred there during the night. It was exactly as it had been every other shift. I drove home in daylight, past people heading to normal jobs with normal schedules, and I kept thinking about those news articles I'd found. The pattern of deaths, always in the early morning hours, always followed by out-of-court settlements and families who stopped asking questions. How many Michael Reeves had there been over the years? How many people who died at 3:47 a.m. in a room that was officially empty? I should have quit. Should have called out sick for my next shift and never gone back. But I couldn't stop thinking about that 1952 study. About Dr. Francis Holloway and his sustained immobilization therapy. About experimental protocols that ran for 5 years and then stopped without any published results. That afternoon, instead of sleeping, I drove to the Providence Public Library and requested access to their historical archives, specifically medical journals and hospital records from the 1950s. And what I found there made me realize that Room 307's deaths weren't the real mystery at all. They were just the symptom of something much larger that had never stopped. The library's special collections had microfiche records of the Rhode Island Medical Journal from 1945 to 1960. I spent 4 hours scrolling through scratchy black and white scans, looking for anything about Mercy Hospital or Dr. Francis Holloway. Most of it was routine medical literature, case studies, treatment protocols, pharmaceutical advertisements that now look horrifyingly primitive. But in the April 1953 issue, I found a brief article authored by Dr. Holloway. The title was Preliminary Observations on Extended Physical Restraint in Treatment-Resistant Anxiety States. The article was only 2 pages long, written in the dry, clinical language of mid-century psychiatry. It described a study of 12 patients who were subjected to what Holloway called therapeutic immobilization, being physically restrained in a supine position for periods of up to 72 hours, while being administered various combinations of barbiturates and early antipsychotic medications. The article noted that all 12 patients showed significant reduction in anxiety symptoms during the immobilization period, but it also noted that 3 patients had withdrawn from the study due to medical complications. It didn't specify what those complications were. It didn't name the patients. And it ended with a note that further research was ongoing and results would be published in a future paper. But there was no future paper. I searched every issue of the Rhode Island Medical Journal from 1953 to 1960. Nothing more from Dr. Holloway. No follow-up, no final results, no conclusions. I expanded my search to other medical journals, other publications. Found only one more reference, a letter to the editor in the American Journal of Psychiatry from November 1957. A physician in Boston had written questioning the ethics of prolonged restraint studies, specifically referencing certain protocols at Rhode Island institutions, without naming Mercy Hospital directly. The letter asked how such studies could be justified given the Nuremberg Code's requirements for informed consent and the prohibition against research that might cause lasting harm. There was no response to that letter printed in subsequent issues. But in December 1957, according to hospital records I found in the library's Providence City archives, Dr. Francis Holloway had abruptly resigned from his position as chief of psychiatry at Mercy Hospital. The board meeting minutes noted only that he had chosen to pursue other opportunities and thanked him for his years of service. What happened to the patients in his study? The ones who didn't withdraw due to medical complications? There was no record of them being transferred. No follow-up documentation. Nothing to indicate what became of 12 people who'd been subjected to 72 hours of physical restraint and experimental drugs in a third-floor psychiatric ward room that was now called Room 307. I left the library as the sun was setting and drove back to my apartment. I had another shift starting in 4 hours. I needed to sleep, needed to eat, needed to prepare myself for another 8 hours in that building. But I couldn't stop thinking about those 12 patients, about the 3 who'd had medical complications, about the 9 others who simply vanished from all documentation after 1957. When I arrived for my shift that night, November 11th, I noticed something new. There was a maintenance request form taped to the door of room 307. Standard hospital paperwork, the kind used to request repairs or modifications. The form indicated that the room was scheduled for deep cleaning and equipment calibration starting the following week. It was signed by someone in the facilities department I'd never heard of. Equipment calibration. But the room was empty. There was no equipment to calibrate, unless they meant the call light system, which kept activating despite having no one to push it. Or unless they meant something else entirely, something that had been there since 1952, something that was still running its protocols after all these years. That night, at 3:47 a.m., I was ready. I'd positioned myself at the nursing station with a clear view of room 307's door. I wanted to see if anything changed, if that room somehow spontaneously filled with equipment and a patient between one moment and the next. I wanted to catch the transition, to document it, to prove I wasn't imagining this. But nothing happened. The door stayed closed. No code blue, no emergency, no Michael Reeves appearing from nowhere. Just a quiet night shift, routine and unremarkable, the kind nurses hope for. It wasn't until I was reviewing the previous night's documentation during my shift that I noticed something in the archived death records. Michael Reeves had died at 3:47 a.m. on November 10th. But when I searched for other deaths in the hospital's system, I found something that made my stomach turn. Every death that had occurred in room 307 for the past 5 years had been recorded at exactly 3:47 a.m. Not approximately, not around that time, exactly 3:47 down to the minute. And all of them had occurred on dates that were exactly 7 days apart. I had 3 days off after that shift, and I spent them trying to convince myself to quit. I'd make a plan to call Mercy Hospital's HR department and resign. Then I'd remember my student loans and the fact that I'd only been a licensed nurse for 4 months. No other hospital would hire me if I quit a position after only 2 weeks without a compelling reason. And I think there's something wrong with room 307. Wasn't going to cut it as a professional explanation. So I did what I'd been trained to do. I looked for documentation. If something unusual was happening at Mercy Hospital, there had to be records. Hospitals document everything. Every medication administered, every vital sign recorded, every procedure performed. That's both liability protection and quality assurance. If patients were dying in room 307 at suspiciously regular intervals, someone had to have noticed, and someone had to have documented their concerns. On November 14th, 3 days before I was scheduled for my next shift, I drove back to Providence and parked outside Mercy Hospital. I wasn't scheduled to work, but my employee badge gave me building access at any time. I waited until late afternoon, when the day shift would be busy with dinner service and evening medication rounds, and I entered through the employee entrance. Marcus was at his security desk, but he barely looked up as I swiped my badge and walked past. I didn't go to the 3rd floor. I went to the basement, where hospital administration kept their archived records, and where I'd seen a door labeled Medical Records Storage 1940-1980 during my initial orientation tour. Hospital basements are universally unsettling. The ceilings are lower, the lighting is worse, and there's always that sense of being underground that makes humans instinctively uncomfortable. Mercy Hospital's basement was particularly grim. Exposed pipes running along the ceiling, painted that same institutional green they used on military ships. Concrete floors that had cracked and been patched multiple times over the decades. The medical records storage room was at the far end of a corridor that seemed to stretch forever under the dim lighting. The door was locked, but it was an old mechanical lock, and I'd learned something during college that had nothing to do with nursing. How to use a bump key. I'm not proud of that knowledge, but it turned out to be useful. The door opened after a few tries, and I slipped inside a room that clearly hadn't been accessed in years. The space was large, maybe 30 feet by 40 feet, with industrial metal shelving units running floor to ceiling. The shelves were packed with cardboard storage boxes, each labeled with date ranges and department names. The air smelled like old paper and mildew, that specific scent of organic material slowly decomposing in less than ideal storage conditions. A single fluorescent light fixture buzzed overhead, providing just enough illumination to read labels if you got close enough. I was looking for records from 1952 to 1957, the years when Dr. Holloway's study had been active. I found the psychiatry department section after 20 minutes of searching, pulling boxes down from shelves and checking their labels. Most of them contained standard documentation, admission forms, treatment notes, discharge summaries. But one box, labeled Ward 3 Special Protocols 1952-1957, was taped shut with yellowed packing tape that had clearly been there for decades. I used my keys to cut through the tape and opened the box. Inside were maybe 24 manila folders, each one labeled with a patient number rather than a name. I pulled out the first folder, Patient 307001, admitted March 1952. The documentation inside was disturbing. The patient had been a 28-year-old man admitted for what the intake forms called combat neurosis, what we'd now call PTSD from his service in World War II. The treatment notes described the first week of Holloway's protocol. 72 hours of continuous physical restraint, with the patient's arms and legs secured to the bed frame using leather straps. During this period, he'd been administered chlorpromazine every 6 hours, despite that drug having only been synthesized the previous year and having almost no established safety data. The notes described the patient becoming increasingly agitated during the second day of restraint. And then the handwriting changed. Someone had written in the margin, in different ink, transferred to observation room for continued monitoring, with no further details about what observation room meant. There was no discharge summary in the folder, no note about the patient leaving the hospital, being transferred elsewhere, or any other resolution. The documentation just stopped on the 5th day of his admission, as if he'd simply ceased to exist. I opened more folders, found the same pattern repeated across 11 different patients, all of them admitted for various psychiatric conditions, all of them subjected to Holloway's restraint protocol, all of them with documentation that abruptly stopped after a few days with notes about being transferred to observation or moved to specialized care unit with no further details. Only one folder was different. Patient 307012, admitted September 1957. This patient's documentation continued for 2 full weeks, with daily notes describing their response to treatment. But the tone of these notes was different from the others, more detailed, almost obsessive. The physician, and it was definitely Holloway's handwriting, I'd seen enough of it by now to recognize it, described the patient's vital signs declining over the course of the restraint period. Heart rate becoming irregular, blood pressure dropping, temperature fluctuating. And then, on day 13, a note that made me go cold. Subject expired at 0347 hours. Cardiac arrest following sustained protocol. Immediate removal and standard disposal procedures initiated. Standard disposal procedures. Like the patient was medical waste, rather than a human being. I photographed every page of every folder with my phone, working quickly because I had no idea when someone might come down to the basement. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, occasionally flickering, and every time it did, I imagined someone opening the door and finding me there with boxes of unauthorized records spread across the floor. The last folder in the box was different from the others. It wasn't labeled with a patient number. It was labeled Protocol Overview and Continuation Plan. Inside was a typed document, clearly prepared by Holloway, dated November 1957, just a month before he'd resigned from the hospital. The document was marked confidential and addressed to someone named Dr. Richard Vance, who apparently was Holloway's supervisor in the psychiatry department. The document explained that the initial study phase had been successful in establishing baseline parameters, but that further research was needed to achieve optimal therapeutic outcomes. It proposed continuing the protocol indefinitely, using the same room, specifically mentioned as Room 307, as a dedicated research space. It suggested recruiting patients from the general hospital population who met certain criteria: no close family members, no established local connections, medical conditions that could plausibly explain sudden deterioration. And then there was a sentence that made everything click into place. The automated monitoring and intervention system installed in room 307 has proven effective at maintaining protocol parameters without requiring constant staff oversight, ensuring consistency of treatment conditions across all future subjects. Automated system. Installed in 1957. Still in room 307, presumably, because I'd never seen any documentation about it being removed. A system designed to maintain protocol parameters, which, based on everything I'd read, meant physically restraining patients and administering drugs on a programmed schedule. A system that had been running its protocols for 67 years, through multiple renovations and changes in hospital administration, because no one knew it was there or thought to look for it. I closed the folders, put everything back in the box exactly as I'd found it, and left the records room. I was careful to lock the door behind me, careful to walk normally through the basement corridors, careful to wave casually at Marcus as I left the building. But my hands were shaking, and my mind was racing through implications I didn't want to consider. If that system was still active in room 307, if it was still running Holloway's protocols on some kind of automated schedule, then every death in that room for the past 67 years hadn't been medical complications or unpredictable human biology. They'd been murders. Systematic, programmed, automated murders, carried out by equipment that had been installed before most of the current hospital staff were even born. And the timing, 3:47 a.m., the exact minute when patient 307-0112 had died in 1957. That wasn't coincidence. That was the system completing its protocol, just as it had been designed to do, just as it had probably done hundreds of times since 1957 to patients who fit Holloway's criteria of being isolated and vulnerable. I drove home and spent the rest of that evening trying to figure out what to do with this information. I couldn't go to hospital administration. They'd either been complicit in covering this up for decades, or they'd been ignorant of it. And I wasn't sure which option was worse. I couldn't go to the police without more concrete evidence. Photographs of old documents weren't going to convince anyone that a hospital was operating a decades-old murder machine in one of its rooms. But I couldn't do nothing. Because my next shift was in 3 days, and if the pattern I'd noticed was correct, deaths occurring every 7 days, always at 3:47 a.m., then someone was going to die in room 307 on November 17th. Someone who would be admitted under circumstances that made them vulnerable. Someone without strong family connections. Someone whose death could be explained away as complications from their existing medical condition. I needed to get into room 307 and find Holloway's system. I needed to document it, photograph it, prove that it existed and was still operational. And I needed to do it before 3:47 a.m. on November 17th, before another person became patient 307-013, or whatever number the hospital had reached in its 6 decades of automated killing. The question was, could I find the system before it found me? I reported for my shift on November 17th, with a plan that was either very brave or very stupid. I'd brought a small toolkit in my bag, screwdrivers, a flashlight, wire cutters, the basic tools someone might need to disassemble medical equipment. I'd also brought my phone fully charged and set to record video, because if I found what I thought I was going to find, I needed documentation that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. The shift started normally. Violet Richardson ran through the patient assignments. I had my usual rooms, 301 through 312, with room 307 still listed as empty pending maintenance. She mentioned that a new admission was expected around 2 a.m., a patient being transferred from Rhode Island Hospital's emergency department. She didn't specify which room the patient would be placed in, but I had a terrible certainty about where they would end up. I worked through my usual rounds, trying to appear normal while my mind raced through what I was planning to do. At 1 a.m., I told Violet I was taking my break, and instead of going to the break room, I went to room 307. The door was unlocked. It had been unlocked for weeks, because empty rooms don't need to be secured. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me. I turned on my flashlight and began a systematic search of the room, starting with the walls, looking for any panels or access points that might hide equipment. And within 5 minutes, I found it. A section of wall near the head of where the bed would be positioned that sounded hollow when I tapped on it. The wall panel was designed to look like part of the regular drywall, but up close I could see faint seams marking a rectangular section about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. There were no visible screws or fasteners. Whoever had installed this had done so professionally, intending for it to remain hidden. I used a screwdriver to carefully pry at the edges, and after a few minutes of work, the panel came loose, revealing a recessed space behind it. Inside was equipment I'd never seen before. It looked like a combination of medical monitoring systems and something more industrial, more mechanical. There was a control unit with dials and switches, all labeled in that precise typographic style from the 1950s. Below that were tanks, 3 of them, each about the size of a scuba diving tank, connected by tubing to a series of valves and regulators. And attached to all of this was what looked like an automated IV system with multiple medication chambers and a programmable delivery mechanism. The control unit had a small display panel, and when I looked closely, I could see it was active. Tiny lights blinking in sequence, indicating the system was powered and operational. There was a timer display showing 0247 Marn, 2 hours and 47 minutes, counting down to 3:47 a.m. I started recording video on my phone, documenting everything I could see. The medication tanks were labeled, though the labels had faded. Chlorpromazine, secobarbital, and something called compound R17 that I'd never heard of. The IV delivery system had programming cards, actual physical punch cards, like old computer systems used, that presumably controlled the dosing schedule. And there was a mechanical component, a system of pneumatic arms and restraints that would presumably deploy from underneath wherever a bed was positioned in the room. This was Holloway's system. This was the equipment that had been installed in 1957, hidden behind a false wall, connected to the hospital's power system, programmed to carry out its protocol automatically whenever a patient was placed in the room. And it was still operational, still counting down to its execution time, still ready to restrain and drug and kill whoever ended up in room 307 tonight. I was examining the medication delivery system when I heard voices in the hallway. Violet and another nurse, discussing room assignments for the new admission, and I heard one of them say, 307 is prepped and ready. I had maybe 2 minutes before they arrived with the patient. I quickly photographed everything I could see, focusing on the labels, the control mechanisms, the proof that this system existed and was active. Then I had to make a decision. Try to disable the system right now, or let them bring the patient in and intervene during the protocol itself, capturing documentation of the system actually operating. The ethical choice was obvious. Disable it immediately, prevent any harm to the incoming patient. But the practical choice was more complicated. If I disabled it now, the hospital would know someone had discovered their secret. They'd remove the evidence, and I'd have nothing but photos that could be dismissed as misunderstood medical equipment. If I waited, if I documented the system actually attempting to harm someone and then intervened to prevent it, I'd have undeniable proof of what was happening in this room. I made the choice that's going to haunt me for the rest of my life. I put the wall panel back in place, positioned it so I could quickly remove it again, and slipped into the bathroom that adjoined room 307. The bathroom was small, just a toilet and sink, but it had a door that locked and a ventilation grate near the ceiling that would allow me to hear everything happening in the main room. I heard them wheel the patient in, heard Violet giving report to whoever was going to be managing this case. A 47-year-old man, admitted from Rhode Island Hospital's emergency department after a fall, no family in the area, currently sedated for pain management. Perfect victim profile, exactly what Holloway's criteria had specified. Isolated, vulnerable, with a medical condition that could explain sudden deterioration. They positioned the bed, hooked up the standard monitoring equipment, and then left. I checked my phone. It was 2:53 a.m., 54 minutes until the system activated. I waited in that bathroom, listening to the patient's breathing through the door, watching the minutes tick by on my phone. At 3:30 a.m., I heard the first mechanical sound, a quiet whirring from behind the wall panel, like motors activating. The system was warming up, preparing to execute its protocol. At 3:40 a.m., I heard the patient make a confused sound, not quite awake, but responding to something changing in the room. I looked through the small gap at the edge of the bathroom door and saw what was happening. Restraints were deploying from underneath the bed, mechanical arms rising up and positioning themselves over the patient's limbs, moving with the precise, programmed motions of industrial automation. At 3:45 a.m., the restraints engaged, and I heard the patient fully wake up, confused and frightened, trying to call for help. And I knew I had exactly 2 minutes before the system reached the point where patient 307-012 had died in 1957. I burst out of the bathroom, rushed to the wall panel, and started tearing it open. The patient was calling out, asking what was happening, why he couldn't move. And I could hear the mechanical IV system beginning to engage, preparing to deliver whatever combination of drugs had killed 12 people in the 1950s, and countless more since then. I grabbed the wire cutters from my toolkit and started severing connections, cutting through tubes and cables, not worrying about being precise or careful, just trying to stop the system before it completed its protocol. The mechanical restraints were pulling tighter, the patient was crying out in pain, and I could hear running footsteps in the hallway. Someone had heard the commotion and was coming to investigate. At 3:46 and 45 seconds, I cut through the main power cable, and everything stopped. The restraints went slack, the mechanical arms retracted, the lights on the control panel went dark. The room fell silent except for the patient's breathing and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Violet appeared in the doorway, saw me kneeling by the wall panel with the hidden equipment exposed, saw the patient in the bed looking confused and frightened, and her expression didn't show surprise. It showed resignation, like this was a situation she'd hoped would never happen, but had always known might. She didn't call security. She didn't threaten me. She just looked at the disabled equipment and said, very quietly, that we needed to talk to hospital administration immediately, before the day shift arrived, because this situation was now beyond what could be handled at the floor nurse level. What happened over the next 6 hours involved lawyers, risk management administrators, and eventually law enforcement. I turned over all my documentation, the photographs from the basement, the video from room 307, everything I'd found about Dr. Holloway's study and the automated system he'd installed. The patient, whose name I later learned was David Morrison, was moved to a different floor and evaluated by physicians who couldn't find any medical explanation for the restraint marks on his wrists and ankles. The hospital tried to settle with me quietly, offering money in exchange for non-disclosure agreements. I refused. The story went public in December 2023, and Mercy Hospital shut down its third floor entirely, pending a full investigation. The system I'd found was examined by engineers and medical device experts, who confirmed it had been operational since its installation in 1957, that it had been drawing power from the hospital's electrical system for 67 years, and that its programming matched the protocols described in Holloway's documentation. They found evidence of the system being serviced and maintained over the decades, which meant someone in hospital administration had known about it, had kept it operational, had continued placing patients in room 307 knowing what would happen to them. Several administrators resigned or were terminated. Criminal investigations were opened, though most of the people directly responsible for maintaining Holloway's experiment were dead or too elderly to prosecute. As for Dr. Francis Holloway himself, I tracked down records showing he died in 1989 in a nursing home in Massachusetts, apparently never having faced any consequences for what he'd done to those 12 patients in the 1950s or the hundreds more who'd died in room 307 since then. Mercy Hospital reopened in March 2024, with the third floor completely renovated and all equipment replaced. Room 307 doesn't exist anymore. They renumbered the rooms, restructured the floor plan, removed any trace of what had been there. But I know what was there. I know what I found behind that wall panel, what I disabled with 2 minutes to spare before David Morrison became another entry in a list of deaths that should never have been allowed to continue past 1957. I don't work at Mercy Hospital anymore. I transferred to a different facility, one without hidden equipment and secret protocols and 67 years of automated murder. But I think about room 307 every single day. I think about how many people died in that room because a system kept running its program long after everyone forgot why it had been installed. I think about how close David Morrison came to being patient 307-213, or whatever number the hospital had reached in its decades of systematic killing. And I think about what else might be hidden in other hospitals, other institutions, other places where the past never quite died because no one thought to check behind the walls.